I am Daryl Nagit, and today I will present my dissertation entitled Translanguaging and the Identity Work of International School Students. To begin with, let us talk about linguistic practices and globalization. The linguistic innovations and the dynamic linguistic practices and resources are observable manifestation of the implications of globalization. Thus, this study subscribes to the linguistic norm that dismantles named languages and affirms the existence of a unitary linguistic repertoire consisting of linguistic and semiotic resources. Moving forward, we also have to understand the connection or link between linguistic practices and identity work. We have to investigate and question the role of language in negotiating and reforming identities. And given this, we have to look for an approach and a theory that is more consistent with the theoretical underpinnings of the study and also consistent with the social linguistic realities, insights of globalization in the contemporary times. Moreover, we can study the interplay between globalization, linguistic practices, and identity work in international schools because they are promising sites consistent with the characterizations and dynamics of globalization. We can see the interplay between globalization, migration, and identity work in these sites. The role of these schools in forming foreign-born international school students' identity is very promising and interesting because we can get to see how migrants and foreign-borns communicate and come in contact with the locals. Given that brief overview of various theoretical underpinnings, we now subscribe to Translanguaging by Lee 2018. According to Lee, Translanguaging comes out of practical concern of understanding the creative and dynamic practices of human beings engaged with multiple named languages and multiple semiotic and cognitive resources. We can clearly see with this definition the consistency of translanguaging in the current investigation. Translanguaging practices allow international school students to achieve a lot of things using their linguistic practices and resources. Some of these are to integrate into the local community, to position themselves in the new and diverse society, to construct their identity, and to match the demands of their interactions and new locality. In relation to the concept of identity, this study subscribes to the idea that identity is not a pre-existing construct. Identity is a product of our interaction with others, and it's prompted by our interlocutors as we socially position ourselves and others during the interaction. Thus, this study subscribes to Buckles and Hall's social linguistic view of identity. It is believed that it's a practical lens in understanding the identities of international school students who are confronted by seemingly contradictory contextual factors, which includes the international standards, the language policy, and the diverse population of their locale. These students rely on available positions. Thus, the investigation of the student's identity work is possible using the relational pairings of Buckles and Hall. In conducting my research, I use an interpretive approach so I can focus on how the students' social lives produce immediate and local meaning. This is a deliberate choice since I acknowledge the potential of the approach to attain detailed insights regarding the students' linguistic practices, integration strategies, and identity work. I define the local meanings from the perspectives of the students, and I observed, documented, and analyzed their interactions and their responses during my ethnographic interviews. Particularly, I used digital linguistic ethnography, and I collected the data in a digital environment for 1 whole year because my data collection period was during the height of the pandemic. I did fieldwork observations and ethnographic interviews to look into the fine details of the linguistic practices and interactions and collect students' or participants' self-reports, respectively. On top of the interactional and interview data, I also collected supplementary data by recording momentary observations, ideas, accounts of feelings, and other instantaneous events in my field notes and research diary. This table summarizes my methodology and my holistic dataset consisting of the interactional, interview, and supplementary data. After collecting and analyzing my data, I came up with 2 empirical chapters to summarize my findings, and these chapters correspond to my research questions. Chapter 3 focuses on the documentation of the translanguaging practices of the international school students, which Van Dijk calls as the students of the new global elites or SONGIs. Chapter 4 focuses on their social-linguistic identity work. Summarizing my findings for Chapter 3, for my research question 1, I found out that the SONGI's linguistic repertoire is a unification of all their various resources and features available for creative and critical selection and use. These students use various features in their unitary linguistic system to strategically navigate the tensions and seemingly contradictory contextual factors in their school, resulting from the global and local interface. The students respond to seemingly contradictory contextual factors through their translanguaging practices. They were observed to be generally compliant with the policy, and they are aware of the role of the policy for their everyday lives in school. However, they also identify gaps in the system and exploit them in momentary and oftentimes subdued way, yet transcendental in nature, since they are instrumental in accomplishing various interactional goals. Moving forward, the interactional goals and the purposes that the translanguaging practices attain were observed to be other and self-oriented. Thus, they have relational value and they are instrumental in successful self-presentation, and they are also used to respond to various overlapping and sometimes contrasting roles or positions in school. Thus, they simultaneously reconcile contrasting orientations, construct aspects of their identities, and relate with others, and this is only made possible through their translanguaging practices. Despite being restricted interactionally, the students of the new global elites in this study also discover and realize momentary chances to maximize their linguistic repertoire or their unitary system. As mentioned earlier, these students purposefully exploit these fleeting opportunities not only to respond to the global and local interface but also to be SONGIs. They remain true to themselves as SONGI by adequating to different centers, adhering to different authorization expectations, and form perceived authentic aspects of their identities. These students position themselves along the lines of Buckles and Hall's relationality pairings. They linguistically index and allow the emergence of their identities during interactions. They constantly form transitory yet valid aspects of their open and multiple identities that culminate into their SONGI identity. After conducting this study, I offered the following conclusions. Globalization and migration result in fluid, diverse, and innovative linguistic practices and identities. The SONGI's unitary linguistic repertoire is a byproduct of their transnational movements and immersions, and it's consisting of infinite possibilities of linguistic practices through natural, flexible, dynamic selection and deployment. This proves Translanguaging of Lee 2018. This study also proves that international schools are promising settings for exploring translanguaging practices and the social linguistic formation of identities. The study also recommends that settings like international schools adopt an approach that aligns with the principles of Alexander's multiculturalism because it's viable and sensitive to people's diverse backgrounds and linguistic practices. The study also proved that Lee's translanguaging can comprehensively document and analyze the linguistic practices of students of the new global elites. We can fully explore and understand their lived experiences and transnational identities which they form during their interactions, and translanguaging can also be used to enrich previous understanding of SONGIs and linguistic practices proposed by earlier scholars like Van Dijk and Bay and Park. Aside from the SONGIs, linguistic resources and practices, we also proved in this study that they strategically and interactionally establish and index their global affiliation and multiple connections. This conclusion affirms that Buckles and Hall's social-linguistic view of identity, particularly the tactics of intersubjectivity, is a plausible framework for examining the Sonji's identities. Through this research, we also established the link between the Sonji's linguistic practices and identity formation. We use translanguaging to account for the entirety of their linguistic repertoire, and we use a social-linguistic view of identity and tactics of intersubjectivity to account for the continuous formation and reformation of their identities. Lastly, we also realized that the methodological challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic offered advantageous opportunities for creative exploration of alternatives and take on linguistic ethnographic research, especially in digital platforms during a global pandemic. Thus, I recommend that future ethnographers may further explore interactions in digital platforms to better understand how practices and interactional contexts affect relationality, self-presentation, and others. And there you have the brief presentation of my dissertation. Once again, this is Daryl C. Nagit. Thank you for listening.